Hello and welcome to another episode in this series looking at the coastline of Durham, Tyne and Wear. And welcome on a day when we haven't got rain at long last, and here we are about midway through May. Never mind, today I'm about 5 miles south of the last location we visited, in a place called Easington. The village is situated a mile from the coast and, similar to the last location, has a younger sibling called Easington Colliery. Like most of English towns, the name of the village comes from Anglo-Saxon words. In this case, it's two words, Essen, which was almost certainly a derivative of Eschwin, meaning a strong friend, and the second part, Tun, meaning village. Essen Tun became Easington. Before we begin the more modern history here in Easington, this spot, not this actual spot that I'm standing on, because as you can probably see behind me, what that black tower that you can see was actually a cage that the miners used to go down the shaft to work, and it's been planted here as a memorial. No, what I'm talking about is this area has a very interesting and unique geological feature from its ancient prehistory. Being once a keen geologist, I couldn't possibly visit this area and leave it out. So just north of here and north of Easington Colliery is a place called Beacon Hill, which is the highest point on the East Durham coast. As I've been saying from the start of this particular series, all the rocks along this coastline forming these magnificent cliffs and caves and stacks are magnesian limestone, formed 290 million years ago in an age known to geologists as the Permian period. The last ice age and its meltwater helped to sculpt the landscape, not just here, but over the entire British Isles. The reason Beacon Hill is a high spot is because it is the crest of a coral barrier reef. Large, but not quite as large as the Great Australian Barrier Reef. But it ran from Sunderland, where Sunderland is today, to Hartlepool, about 20 miles in length, northwest to southeast. Britain, at the time of the formation of the reef and the limestone beneath it, was under a warm, shallow, salty sea in the middle of the supercontinent scientists call Pangaea. The sea was landlocked, the same as the Dead Sea of today. Geologists know the sea today as the Zechstein Sea. The coral reef grew just offshore to a significant height. As millions of years passed, Pangaea broke to form the continents we know today, and as we all know, Britain ended up as an island. Due to climate change, the Ice Age buried Britain and most of Northern Europe around 15,000 years ago under a blanket of ice hundreds of feet thick. Because the limestone formed in the reef is much harder than the magnesian limestone laid down on the sea floor, it resisted the weathering of the Ice Age. The frozen glaciers and then the running water from when they melted about 5,000 years ago eroded the softer rocks away, leaving Beacon Hill and other high spots standing proud of the landscape. Once the ice was all gone, valleys and hills were left behind with fast-flowing rivers, which sculpted the landscape along with the North Sea to form the magnificent cathedral-like rock formations we see today along the entire coast from South Shields to Hartlepool. No evidence exists today, but Beacon Hill would have almost certainly had a Roman signal tower on it. Later, during the Saxon period and the Middle Ages, the hilltop had a signal beacon on it, and that was to warn of passing ships of the dangerous rocks close by. But also in times of conflict, it was used to warn of a potential invasion, and those signal towers were dotted all the way along, in fact all the way around Britain's coast. Two buildings dominate the village. The first is the Church of St Mary, and the second is a stone manor house called Seaton Home, built in the 13th century. The manor is said to have been home to Nicholas Breakspear for a while. Born in Hertfordshire, he was the only Englishman to become Pope. Physical evidence of architectural fragments are found in the walls of St Mary's Church, dating back to the 700s. Easington's early history was agricultural land belonging to the Bishop of Durham. The first written record of the village is in 900 AD, when it was given to an Elfrid, spelt E-A-L-F-R-I-D, by the Bishop of Durham. And it rather intrigued me because with a lot of these spellings, Aelfred, of course, in more modern times becomes Alfred. And I was intrigued to know whether this could possibly have been the legendary King Alfred. However, a quick check of my dates in my reference, and I realised that King Alfred died in 899 AD, so it couldn't possibly be him. If anyone watching this can shed some light on who this Elfred was, so important that he should receive the gift of this land, then please drop a comment below the video and share that information with us. Once William the Conqueror had established himself as the new ruler of England, he ordered the Domesday Book in 1086 to document exactly what it was he had conquered. As I said in the Northumberland series last year, the survey ceased at York. He wasn't interested in anything north of that. William the Conqueror regarded Durham and Northumberland as no more than a buffer zone between his lands and the Scottish, the wild and unruly Scottish to the north. So that's why he was only interested in York and South. So it was the Bolden Book or the Bolden Buke, as the Geordies pronounce it, ordered by the Bishop of Durham 107 years later in 1193, that documented the settlements of the bishopric. Easington is recorded in that book as agricultural, with several small holdings, each resident having to give 3 days' work to the bishop in return for food and drink. Evidence of its agricultural past can be seen with the remains of a windmill built in 1260. Today that is turned into a private residence, and it sits right on the side of the busy A19 dual carriageway. Even though Easington remained relatively small in size, it didn't escape the misery, pestilence and oppression that befell the rest of the region. Easington was of no interest to the Romans, but their successors, the Vikings, ransacked it when they invaded the coast during the 8th and 9th centuries. During Edward II's reign, Easington was burned by the Scots when they invaded in the early 1300s. For a period after the Scottish raids, the village lay desolate. When families began to repopulate the area, it was the Black Death plague of 1349 that hit the village. In 1377, the then Bishop of Durham, Bishop Hatfield, carried out a detailed survey to get the picture of what the state of the region was. Only 9 tenants were recorded working the 300 acres that Easington covered. Easington did get off reasonably lightly, as the other locations already mentioned earlier in this series were much harder hit than Easington. As I mentioned previously, the people of Durham were not loyal to the Crown like the Geordies were. Anybody not living in the northeast of England might think that Durham's in the north, so they're Geordies. Well, they're not really. Geordies are it's the area strictly around a certain, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's a certain distance from the River Tyne itself. So Northumbrians are not really Geordies, and nor people from Sunderland, and certainly not people from Durham. So I just wanted to clarify that little bit. So the Geordies who supported the Crown were the people of Newcastle and Tyneside itself. But everybody else was quite happy to side with the Scots because they were looking to their own means. And of course, if the Mary Queen of Scots took the throne, not only could they keep the Catholic religion, but also there was rewards in it for them, because obviously to join the Scots they would have been promised lands and riches and all the rest of it. So in 1569, 6 men from Easington had joined a group led by the Northern Earls to depose Elizabeth I and put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne of England. The plot failed, of course, and Mary Queen of Scots was captured, taken to London and beheaded. Her supporters were rounded up and executed, and 2 of the 6 men from Easington were hung on the village green. The next catastrophe to hit Easington was during the Civil War of 1642. Many fled the area ahead of the advancing Scottish army under Alexander Leslie. The particular advance of the Civil War and how it affected this area is mapped out in the South Shields episode. So if you head over there, if you haven't already watched that episode, head over there and look at that. But it points out in that episode that Alexander Leslie eventually captured Newcastle, and during the year he occupied Newcastle, he used that as a base to ransack much of the county of Durham, and in particular Easington. Leslie particularly wanted revenge on Durham because of the actions of the former Bishop of Durham, Anthony Beck. Anthony Beck had assisted Edward I in defeating William Wallace and the Scots at Falkirk in 1298. And it was that particular act of betrayal that Alexander Leslie wanted revenge for. Just southwest of Darlington is Ravensworth Castle, and in 1787 Henry George Liddell was born son of Sir Henry Liddell, the 5th Baronet of Ravensworth. He became rector of Easington in 1829 and lived at Seaton Home. His eldest son was also called Henry George Liddell, and he became the Dean of Oxford University. He had a daughter called Alice, and by the age of 10, she and her friends were looked after by a young teacher at the university named Charles Ludwig Dodgson. During the long summer holidays, Charles and the local priest would take the children on river picnic adventures. Alice would beg Charles to invent a story to tell her and her friends during their afternoon adventures. Charles called his stories Alice's Adventures Underground. Alice persuaded Charles to write them down so she could read them before bed back at home. Of course he did, and that became the book we are all familiar with, Alice in Wonderland. Because of its immediate fame, Charles adopted the pen name of Lewis Carroll, of course. Alice kept the original manuscript until 1932, when she auctioned it at Sotheby's to pay for her husband's death duties. It sold to an American buyer, Eldridge Johnson, for £15,400. Easington may not have had any famous movie stars or singers born here, but at least it can boast that the famous Lewis Carroll book was written about little Alice from here in Easington. I'm not sure what the connection was, but apparently Lewis Carroll wrote the book whilst staying in this house in Whitburn. The 1850s saw the start of the coal rush here in East Durham, but it didn't actually arrive here in Easington until 1899. A mine was opened between the village and the coast, and once again new homes were built to house the workforce. And the mine was somewhere on this plot of land where I'm standing, and as I said earlier, that's a relic from the mine. That was the cage that the miners went down to work and came back up again. But you can see from behind me how close it was to the beach. This separate settlement was called Easington Colliery and quickly grew, merging with the original village of Easington but it kept its distinct name. Like most pits of the northeast, Easington had its disasters, and in the May of 1951 an underground explosion claimed the lives of 83 men. They were buried in a garden of remembrance in the cemetery. Easington Colliery, just like its neighbouring pits at Seaham, used the beach to dump its waste. Like Seaham, it was dumped via a conveyor belt straight into the sea. Easington Colliery was the last coal mine in Durham to close, but it was also the scene of the most fierce confrontation between the miners and police during the strike of 1984. Just to fill you in on the background, if you're not familiar with that period in British politics, Margaret Thatcher, the Tory Prime Minister and the first female Prime Minister of England, began closing coal mines and steelworks in a plan to modernise Britain and further integrate with Europe. This particularly hit the working class people of the north, putting tens of thousands out of work and into extreme poverty. Today, the decision to close the mines may seem a sensible one, given how much we are suffering now with climate change. But to the families living here, it was the end of their livelihood and way of life. There were many scenes shown on television of violent clashes with police as the months of hardship hit hard all across the north. But this being the last pit to go, this was the last stand for the miners. The BBC recently released a special programme on the strike of 1984. If you want to watch it, there is a link below for viewers in the UK. Alternatively, access the BBC iPlayer and search Miners' Strike, a frontline story. Some of the streets here in Easington were used for shooting the scenes of the Billy Elliot film, released in 2000, and it was set in the fictional town of Everington during the strike of 1984. With the mine gone, the beach was cleaned and restored, again with recent lottery funding. Easington Beach is not easy to access as it is separated from the village by the coastal railway line between Sunderland and Hartlepool. To get to the beach, it's a case of parking here in the Easington Colliery Nature Reserve, which is what the mine site is turned into today. Very pleasant, I must say, and car parking here and then walking about a mile underneath the railway underpass to the coast, and then there's a sort of a pathway leads you down onto the beach. About a mile, as I say, so not too far. That's all the information for Easington. We're next going to move about a mile further down south, heading on our journey, but I'm going to leave you for a few moments just to appreciate the views of Easington, and I'll see you all again in a few moments. Hello again. I'm now just south of Easington in another mining community called Horden. The name Horden comes from two Anglo-Saxon words, horu meaning dirty and den referring to Eden Dean, a wooded valley just to the south of the village. Before the mine arrived in 1900, Horden was a 17th century manor house surrounded by farms and agricultural land. The hall belonged to a baronet called Sir John Conyers, and it was known as Horden Hall. Sir Thomas Conyers, who became the 9th baronet, was the 6 times great-grandfather of Kate Middleton on her mother's line. The mine here was one of the largest in England and regarded as the jewel in the crown of the Durham Coalfield. It was sunk to exploit the coal deep under the North Sea, and at its peak in 1930 it employed 4,000 men. It extracted 1.5 million metric tonnes each year. It became unprofitable in the 1970s due to the ingress of seawater and other geological problems, resulting in its closure in 1987. Like its neighbouring villages, Horden dumped its coal waste on the beach. The village has been revamped along with its beach with local government and lottery funding. A pleasant park hosts another sculpture by Ray Lonsdale. This time the sculpture is called Mara, which is a Geordie word meaning a mate or a friend. The sculpture depicts a miner with his heart ripped out, symbolising the loss of the region's coal industry, which was its beating heart. Looking at Horden on Google Maps, you can see it runs into neighbouring Peterlee. I don't want to go too deep into the history of Peterlee as it's not really part of the Durham coastline. However, it is quite unique and worth a mention. Peterlee is a new town built between 1950 and 1970 to address the problem of people living in squalor in poor quality mining terraces in East Durham. Peterlee is the only new town in England to be requested and campaigned for by the local people. It is also one of a small number of new towns named after a recent individual. Peter Lee was born in Crimdon near Sedgefield and began working in the mines aged 10 years old. He became a local coal hewer at 16 before emigrating to Pennsylvania to work in the mines there. Peter returned to Britain a year later and became involved in the labour movement. In 1919, he was the chairman of the first ever Labour Council in Durham. He died in 1935, never knowing he would have had a town named after him. The town was meant to be a New Age settlement like others in England at that time, but poor design and poor building techniques led to years of modern-looking houses suffering all sorts of structural issues. A lot of those issues have been resolved nowadays, and Peterlee today retains its 1950s style, but with better functionality. Peterlee's best feature is the natural beauty of Castle Eden Dean Nature Reserve, a 3-mile stretch of wooded valley from the A19 dual carriageway to the sea at Horden Beach. Just a mile to the south is Blackhall, nowadays existing in two parts, Blackhall Rocks and Blackhall Colliery. The pit at Blackhall Colliery opened in 1909 and followed a similar pattern to the neighbouring pits. The sinkers, the men who specialised in digging out the vertical shafts, had to live in caves in the cliffs along the shoreline. The terraced rows you see here were only built later in 1913, when the mine first started to extract the coal. There were no disasters in the mine in its 72-year life, but 69 miners were killed in individual accidents. They are remembered in the community hall. Blackhall Rocks, however, began back in the Stone Age, with caves in the cliffs providing dwellings for these early settlers. For many centuries, the land was a collection of small agricultural estates run by the local gentry. When the Normans arrived, Alan de Hardwick, a Norman baron, built Hardwick Hall Manor. It was then passed down various generations until 1391, when it was sold to the Aske family. Robert Aske was the political leader of the Pilgrimage of Grace I mentioned in episode 5, if you remember, when we were in Whitburn. The Pilgrimage of Grace, if I can get my words out, was an uprising against Henry VIII's suppression of the Catholic Church. As fast as Henry VIII was murdering or banishing the Catholic bishops, Aske and his followers were smuggling more in from France at Blackhall Rocks. From Hardwick Hall Manor, they would then be dispersed around England, often having to hide in priest holes, purely to keep the Catholic religion alive and defy King Henry. Robert Aske was, of course, arrested and executed for treason in 1537. During the mining years, Hardwick Hall was the headquarters of the Horden Coal Company. When the mine closed in 1981, the hall became a hotel and wedding venue. The beach was another of Durham's beaches used for the dumping of mine waste. A series of pylons carried the waste in huge buckets along a cable ropeway into the sea. The last pylon actually stood in the sea. The scene was captured in the 1971 film Get Carter, starring Michael Caine. Just like the other beaches on this Durham coastline, a great deal of effort to clean and restore them has been undertaken by the local authority with the help of lottery and European funding. Okay, that's all the information for this particular area, so I will now leave you to see the beaches from above, as well as the views of Horden, Hardwick Hall, Blackhall and Peterlee, and I will see you back here in a few moments. Hi again. So, as I said before, that's it for this particular episode. If you've enjoyed it, give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already done so, and keep supporting the channel in all the normal ways, sharing it with your friends, keep watching, keep the viewer numbers up, and just support the channel in whatever way you can. From here, we're going to the next port of call, which is Hartlepool. And it is there where I will see you next in the next episode. So until then, I wish you all the very best of health and my very best wishes, and goodbye for now.